We need more consensus across the political spectrum to get housing delivered.
First of all, I do agree that this is a huge priority and we absolutely want to get...
Why isn't the Prime Minister's priority? They're talking about NOS canisters and stopping the boats. And here you are saying, well, actually, it's a big priority. Then why is the government fucking ignoring it? Why Liz Truss was elected Prime Minister off the back of saying that housing targets were fucking Stalinist. And you're telling me, as a Conservative Minister, that it's one of your top priorities? Go fuck yourself.
I would like to ask the panel, is it a bit rich for the rich to tell us to accept being poorer?
Well, so what you're referring to, Sunil, aren't you, is these comments by the Bank of England's chief economist, Hugh Pill, who, paraphrasing what he says, he's basically saying people in the UK need to accept that we're all worse off and we have to take our share and that we need to stop trying to get a pay rise because that's going to make everyone poorer, and businesses equally need to stop putting their prices up. Camilla.
And before they even answer the question, it's just the Bank of England is genuinely pathetic when you have Andrew Bailey literally begging companies not to put prices up as if capitalism is just going to stop functioning because the Bank of England asks really fucking nicely. And on the other hand of that, you've got the people from the Bank of England, like Hugh Pill, saying that we can't have wage increases because we can't impact the fact that companies are literally currently still making record profits and have been continuing to make profits throughout the entire pandemic and have had billions of pounds of quantitative easing shoveled into their pockets over the course of the pandemic spending as well, right? It's so fundamentally hypocritical, especially considering that, bankers have had their bonuses lifted, for example, that suddenly all of these, apparently the economy is going to be not shrinking, but there's going to be some growth. And apparently that the difference between the lack of economic growth that we've had and what we could have previously been having, to make up for that, people on the front line, the people who actually generate the material wealth of our civilization, are the ones that have to deal with the negative effects of that the hardest. And that's basically how it's been ever since 2008. The poor had to pay for the bailing out of the banks. The poor had to pay for it with austerity, and now the poor are having to pay with it with inflation. When's it going to be our turn to actually get the gains of our economy into our own hands, rather than it being siphoned off into the pockets of people who do not contribute a single fucking thing to this country?
Well, there is obviously a legitimate economic argument for saying that if everybody is given inflation-busting pay rises, then it's only going to serve to fuel inflation and make everything even more expensive than it already.
Wage price spiral is nonsense. Stop it. Especially not in the public sector where the vast majority of pay rises are coming from. Pay rises in the private sector are basically all behind inflation. There are a few industries in the public sector that have got inflationary pay rises, which obviously make up for huge amounts of pay cut over the austerity periods. So it's not even that much of an inflation-busting pay rise when you really think about where they actually were 15 years ago, for example. So yeah, actually, it's not a wage price spiral. You can't have a wage price spiral in the public sector. That's not how that works.
Already has been. But I think when you've got a situation where the tax burden is at an all-time high, the highest since the Second World War, and most people are looking at their pay packets and thinking they're not getting enough of their money back in their pocket, and they're going to the supermarket and dealing with sky-high prices, and they're dealing with energy bills that they can't afford to pay, and they're running vehicles possibly with ever-increasing fuel prices, and indeed the cost of train fares alone as well has gone up. You can't blame people for...
Actually, what's interesting is the train fares actually haven't gone up. They're usually pegged to retail price index, but they've actually gone up less than that, which means that of all of the things that have really increased in price, train prices actually haven't increased that much in comparison to everything else, considering that they are usually pegged to the retail price index.
Asking for pay rises. I think the issue for the government, and we've got teacher strikes today and then again next week and a debate over those, is where does one set the percentage rise in order for it to be fair for the public sector workers who feel that they are inadequately rewarded, but also to be fair to the private sector who are going to struggle to get pay rises if the firms that they're working...
Private sector pay is already like 4 points ahead of public sector pay increase for the previous financial year up to April 2023. The private sector are already getting good pay rises. The public sector just need catching up, especially considering the fact there's been public sector pay freezes during the austerity period, whilst people in the private sector have continually seen their wage at least moderately increase when you compare it to the public sector, right? This idea that somehow public sector pay increases are at the expense of misery in the private sector, that's just a complete distortion of reality when you look at how public sector pay looks in comparison to private sector pay over the course of the last decade, of the last 13 years, in totality. And even then, the private sector could get pay rises if they really wanted, if they just joined a fucking union, right? Technically, the rail is the private sector. It's privately owned. The RMT are in dispute with Rail Delivery Group, which is, that's private. That's a private company. So the idea this is public sector versus private sector, which again is always the right-wing messaging to try and undermine public sector strikes by trying to say, oh, well, you in the private sector, that's against you, that's against your interest. These are the bad people, they're being greedy, and not you. You're the nice workers not asking for the pay rises because they know that there is a difference in levels of unionization between the two sectors that makes them easy to divide and conquer them. Whereas if you don't get the same thing if you look at Denmark or you look at Norway or you look at France, for example, or Germany, where overall levels of union density across the country, both in public and private sectors, are far, far greater, far denser overall, and they have sectoral bargaining agreements, which means that you don't see this public-private disparity, at least not as much as you do in the UK.
For are struggling in the current economic climate. I think there does have to be a sense of kind of collectivism, that we do know that at the moment things are pretty difficult for very many different reasons. Some perhaps of the government's making, some perhaps of the world's making, if you consider the Ukraine war, the post-pandemic environment and all the rest of it. But do we want to hear from people on six-figure salaries that people on much less money should not be asking for more money? No, probably not. And I think, it was a very, very clumsy and insensitive way of expressing himself.
Lisa?
I think fundamentally there has to be some expectation that there is going to be some hit to income. There's going to be some hit to standard of living because of the inflationary period. And I don't necessarily disagree that that's a thing that might happen, even if we had a massive wealth tax, even if we seized the means of production overnight away from the oligarchs of the country. I don't think that we would necessarily get rid of all of the pressures that's coming from the increase in food prices, the fallout from the pandemic, the issues with the war in Ukraine. Those things don't go away when you have a different economic model. But fundamentally, what you have to think is that when you look at what Hugh Pill is saying here, he's saying we have to protect profits at the expense of workers. That's what he's saying with his comments about wage rises. That's different than saying we're all going to feel at least some of a pinch from the exogenous economic pressures that everyone has to deal with. But his comment specifically about the wage rises, for example, is saying that you cannot impact the company's profits by asking for a bigger section of the revenue generated from these businesses. That's the real issue of what he said.
I mean, I don't think anyone in this country would argue for a moment that Britain isn't worse off after 13 years of Tory government. It's only been a few months since Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng crashed the economy, sent interest rates through the roof and left hundreds of thousands of people paying hundreds of pounds more on their mortgages every month. We're all paying the price.
And their rent. The mortgage costs got passed on in rent. Please stop talking about mortgage holders as they are the only people whose housing costs matter. For the love of God, Lisa and Andy, you are the shadow levelling up minister.
Price for that. What I will never accept is that once again working people should pay the price for those failures. The truth is that this is about political choices. We could have a windfall tax on the profits of big oil and gas producers, and we could help people with their energy costs or the rising council tax costs or any of the other costs that are going up right now. We could end non-dom tax status and get money into our National Health Service, help to deal.
She said the line, Rodeberg. You got there before I did, though. Nostradamus in chat already.
With the current disruption in the National Health Service, and provide some light on the hill for those frontline workers who have been holding us together through COVID, holding us together through a decade of austerity, and are now currently having to choose between feeding their own families or caring for ours.
But isn't Labour saying something
The government...
to some public sector workers that is similar to what Hugh Pill is saying.
No,
I mean, so the health secretary, the shadow health secretary, sorry, Wes Streeting, is saying to junior doctors, for example, who are asking for 35%, he said, look, hand on heart, I couldn't offer you 35% if I was in power. And they're saying, well, if we don't get 35%, we are going to be worse off. And so Wes is saying, well, realistically, yes, you are going to have to accept being worse off. That is actually what he's saying.
I think everyone in this country is currently accepting the fact that there is pain that they're bearing. The question is, where is the hope? Where is the plan? Where is the plan to start getting resources into our frontline workforce? You know, look at the teacher strike at the moment. We've got a real problem here. We've got lots of kids suffering severe disruption. We've got lots of teachers really struggling to make ends meet. And we've got teachers leaving the profession. For 9 out of the last 10 years, the government hasn't been able to recruit enough secondary school.
The realistic position is to put in place a long-term plan which addresses pay and staffing. Well, that's 100% the truth, right? And you also, you just have to talk about changing fundamentally the models of a lot of these things. When you look at, for example, what's happening with the NHS, with the amount of money that's being put in, but given the structure of the NHS, how much money is being paid out to essentially cover the dividends being paid out by the private contractors who've been given free rein to access the government's paybook or with regard to NHS contracts over the last 13 years that was massively expedited and increased during the pandemic, paying the costs for agency workers, for nurses, paying for the 80% increase in generics pharmaceutical prices as a result of cartelization of the European pharmaceuticals market, which would have been, the momentum of that would have been arrested by having a state-owned drug manufacturer that was being proposed in the previous Labour manifestos, for example. These are all things that you could change the structure of the NHS to ensure that the money was going to the right place, going to doctors, going to frontline care, going back into patient care rather than the pockets of the people, giving the bonuses, being paid the dividends as a result of NHS privatisation. You have to reverse that. That's how you fix the NHS to ensure that we can afford to be able to do that. And to, again, that is a proper long-term plan addressing pay and that does address staffing, as well as having more places open for doctors to study in the UK, whilst also making sure that we have give access to people wanting to come to this country as a doctor to be able to work in the NHS. Don't know why they would, but we have to keep those doors open.
Teachers. What does it mean? It means everybody suffers. And the government knows that you could make different choices because they made choices.
But would Labour make the choice to give all... Hang on, Lisa. Would Labour make the choice to give all these people pay rises as high as inflation?
No, look, I'm not going to start promising that we'll open negotiations live on television.
No, I'm not expecting you to do that. But nonetheless, if you've got people who are asking for above-inflation pay rise, I haven't heard Labour saying, yes, we will do that. In which case, what Hugh Pill says is a reality.
No, sorry, we will never make promises that we don't know that we can keep, because this is people's money and they haven't got
yeah, unless, of course, you're Keir Starmer and you're running for leadership of the Labour Party.
A lot of it. Well, but what we would never do in the face of the falling living standards, real terms wages and a cost of living crisis is give a £1 billion tax cut to the richest 1%. I just think that is unconscionable.
Well, the problem is that it's not, like, whilst these answers are what we need, right? Optically, I think that, again, given Lisa Nandy's background, she's saying a lot of the right things about the political choices that get made, who pays for what, the division of wealth in this country, all great things. And yeah, you're right. It isn't prudent to comment on what they would do. For example, we're still possibly a year and a half away from a general election, and to say, look, I'm not going to make up policy on the fly. I mean, if the Labour leadership had made a promise already and saying specifically for, junior doctors, as I've said before, I think they should do this. I think optically it'd be good for them to say, I'll tell you what we'll do. We are going to give the medical staff exactly that pay rise to bring them back into where they were last time Labour were in government. We are the party of the NHS. We are going to make that commitment. But obviously without the top of the party making that commitment already, Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting, Health Secretary and Leader of the Opposition, Lisa Nandy is in the position where she cannot make these promises live on TV, otherwise she'll be in the shit. But what she can do is say we will open negotiations, but we want to talk about the overall political choices that go into the fact that the cost of living crisis is being felt by poor people but not by rich people. But what you should be doing is talking about wealth taxes, right? saying that, we'll have windfall taxes, we will have, some amount of negotiations to look at pay restoration, the political choices need to get made, fine, whatever. But that wealth has already filtered up. Those people have those assets have massively increased in the asset economy. You do not get those back without a wealth tax, right? You do not get back all of the individual assets that are now owned by the super rich that have now had their asset value massively increased unless you force them to give them back. And you have to do that doing a wealth tax. That's the thing that needs to happen.
Not everybody's getting poorer. There are 20% more billionaires in this country now than there were before the pandemic.
Okay.
And they're getting a tax
Man
cut.
here in the front.
The second insensitive comment by someone from the Bank of England. I do deliveries for a local charity to people who are vulnerable, and people are struggling to make ends meet. So one is what the bank does. The second is the whole aspect of insensitive comments. I think it's a very insensitive comment.
Okay. Leila.
So Sunil's question was, is it a bit rich? I mean, I think it does show that he doesn't do as much door knocking as me, that's for sure. I keep coming across people, and I dare say it's local elections coming up next week, but this is the top issue that keeps coming up on doors, and stories that just break your heart. I had a lady who, she herself works in a nursery. She's got 2 kids herself being taken care of in a childcare setting. She has medication she needs to buy, and the perverse choice that she had to make this week was, does she go to the pharmacy to get her depression medication, or does she go to the supermarket to put food on the table for her children because she no longer can afford to do both? That is the Britain that this Conservative government has left us with. There are many choices that can be made, and the one, for example, to release the cap on bankers' bonuses was not one that I think is the right one. Whenever you've seen what they do with the economy on taxation, whatever else, what they do is they put stealth taxes in. It's not progressive. It's not protecting the most vulnerable. And we are now faced in a situation where the country's just not working, and we just need...
Okay, so yes, the tax burden is being disproportionately placed upon the kind of lower end of the income scale. I agree. How are you going to change that? You're going to start taxing dividends. You're going to start taxing capital gains. Are you going to do a wealth tax? What are you going to change, Layla? That's the thing. How are we going to essentially fight against the vested interests at the top of our economy who are rigging it in their favour and pushing the results of this economic turmoil onto the people who have the narrowest shoulders to be able to bear it?
To get them out. And that's why many people are not voting Conservative for the first time, some of them, in these local elections. They're turning to the Lib Dems in my area, certainly, and this is the top issue as to why.
Let's hear a bit more from our audience. Yes, the woman there.
Would MPs consider giving public services such as nurses and teachers the same pay rise that they have received?
All right, we'll ask in a minute. Yes, the man in the back with the glasses and the stripy tie, I think you've got. Yeah.
It was 0.
So my question was, not my question, my comment was going to be, it is definitely in terms of political choice. So we were told after the last financial crash, like 10 years ago, okay, you have to put up with like no pay rises for now. So it's been 10 years on. So my generation, so I would have graduated about 2010, we've never had a pay rise in line with inflation. Like people are putting off having families, buying homes, all of that stuff. And when you look, I think the other part of it is looking at the consequences of these political decisions. So if, for example, you put the burden of tax on those who are the most vulnerable, they are going to have to choose between doing very extreme things, like, do I buy my medication? Do I buy food? If you put the tax burden on the very rich, it's like, okay, I have a slightly smaller bank balance at the end of the year, but you're still rich. You're still a billionaire. And the other thing I'd like to say, when I say rich, I don't mean people who are on like 100,000, 200,000. We're talking about the people who have billions. Like, you have people in this country who have billions. You can never spend it in a lifetime. You could.
But you can't do that with income tax, right? Because income tax is only people who are employed, who are paying themselves a salary from the businesses that they own. If they're that rich, any money that they make is being paid out in dividends, which is taxed lower than income, or it's being kept in stock portfolios. That's why they're billionaires, is because they own loads of assets, right? That's it, right? So that's why you can't just say, "Oh, we need taxation on additional rates of income tax, whatever." Which probably I would be happy with having the 50p rate put back that we had beforehand, or whatever it might be, increasing the 45p to 50p, whatever it might be, to tax the high earners in our society. But outside of that, we do need a wealth tax. We need to be able to get these people to sell down their stock, decrease their asset prices, force them to be able to have to dump some of their assets to pay for a tax on the total value of those assets if they are one of these incredibly super rich people, because they probably don't even have the liquidity to be able to pay just a higher rate of income tax, because that's not where their income comes from.
You could never spend it in 10 lifetimes. Like, why is it that you're then putting the burden on people who have no money? Like, it doesn't make sense.
And one here in front.
I cannot believe how insensitive that comment is when you are having people in our Great Britain who cannot afford to eat and heat. Our elderly population, our parents, our grandparents have to decide, do I put the heating on or do I eat? In Great Britain, not acceptable. I understand times are tough and we have to tighten our belts for a short period of time. How long for, though? How long are we going to be in this situation? And what is the government going to do about it?
But also, what is the Bank of England going to do about it? Because the other thing that Hugh Pill didn't acknowledge when he made this comment is the role that the Bank of England has played in this. The gentleman there referenced 2008. You know, the Bank of England has presided over ultra-low interest rates and huge amounts of quantitative easing that has pushed inflation up. And yet there seems to be...
No, it hasn't. That's not what the inflation's coming from. The inflation is coming from exogenous factors. It's coming from the supply shocks. It's coming from the war in Ukraine. That's why we're seeing inflationary pressures across the Eurozone, across the entirety of the European market, are seeing huge costs due to inflation. And you can see the difference in inflation based upon where people are and how their economy functions, where you look at food inflation being, 30% in some countries, and like Balkan states, for example, or in Baltic states as well. They've got very high inflation because they rely on far more on Ukraine in the Balkan states or Russia in the Baltic states for their food imports, which they're now not getting. So this is all, there is no evidence that you've got the inflationary pressures are the result of quantitative easing. There are additional inflationary pressures that have come from the increase in interest rates because CPI does include the increase that's rental payments have been made, or what rental payments would be if you own the house that you pay the mortgage on. But that's not necessarily the vast majority of our inflationary pressures.
No responsibility at all taken for that.
So, Rachel, as you give pretty universal objection to what Hugh Pill had to say, people find it insensitive. I can see why.
Yeah.
But the reality is, when you think about the government's negotiations with public sector workers, that is exactly what you're asking the public sector to do, is to accept being poorer.
So I think it obviously...
You might not phrase it like that, but it's actually the reality.
So I think it's obviously an insensitive comment. And look, the government recognises that times are tough.
True, De Wolfie. I think we should just accept being poorer, because that makes the rich richer by comparison, and then that can trickle down to us eventually. So true, De Wolfie. 100%.
We've had a global pandemic. We've had Putin's illegal and brutal war in Ukraine, and these factors have impacted our economy. No. It's nothing to do with Brexit.
It's nothing to do with Brexit.
We have had a very difficult time. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Not all of it, but a bit. Well, I don't really think...
No worries, Kevin. I'll see you later. But again, I've said a long time that I think the anti-Brexit people apportion too much blame to these kind of crises onto Brexit specifically. I think there's a big problem that we have in trying to tackle these issues where there's a large section of the population who rightly apportion at least some of the blame onto economic pressures to Brexit, but there is a large portion of that group of people who think that it's the only reason. It's the only reason why our country specifically is seeing massive increases in food prices, the biggest energy price hikes in Europe, bar none, essentially. We're one of the highest energy prices in Europe overall, and we were even before the current inflationary pressures. We have a garbage system, and they put this down to Brexit. as the sole cause. And I'm not saying it is not a contributory factor, as I've said on the stream before, but you've got to look at the broader economic policies that have led us to this place, that were in place from 2010 to 2016, right? Before the Brexit referendum, these economic pressures were still being felt by the poorest in society too. Obviously now the middle-class Remainer types who are fundamentally feeling the same things now that poor people were feeling during the austerity period, they can't see the difference other than Brexit because it happened in 2016. They can't see they can't fundamentally understand that for the rest of the population. What they're seeing now, due to what they apportioned to Brexit, was the life for people on the breadline in 2010 to 2016 because of austerity.
I think it's the right time to be rerunning a referendum that we had many years ago where the country voted to leave the European Union. I can't believe we're bringing it back. The Liberal Democrats want to overturn a democratic referendum that we had. Go back into the European Union.
I mean, to be fair, it was 7 years ago. If they wanted to have another referendum, like, that would be within their right to do so, and people should vote the way. You can't just say that more democracy is bad. Right? It's been a long time, and to be fair, we've only just left the European Union. And to be fair to the Brexiteers, the people who wanted Brexit but didn't want this kind of Brexit's basically been ruined. Anything that people wanted to get out of it, say for example, if immigration was one of the main things people voted for example, that Brexit's been ruined by the ridiculous ERG red lines, by the nonsense hard Brexit that was pushed for by Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party and all of his cronies in the Conservative Party, which is why Brexit's been such a massive failure. Because we've not looked at EFTA, we've not looked at the customs union, we've not looked at a closer relationship that's not necessarily a full member state relationship that would be leaving the European Union under the mandate that was given by the referendum. But because they've pushed this nonsense hard Brexit, the Remainers feel 100% vindicated that everything is a Brexit issue, and the Brexiteers fundamentally have no leg to stand on with any arguments they could give for any theoretical positive benefit for it, because it's basically been entirely hamstrung by a group of crank ideologues who had no care for the negative externalities of the ridiculous hard Brexit that they wanted to be able to get, which the public overwhelmingly actually didn't really support.
That's quite astonishing. But getting back to the economy...
I think what Leila was saying was that she was disputing that whether Brexit had anything to do with the current economic situation. You're saying it has nothing.
Are you saying it has nothing to do with the fact that in G20 countries we are now behind Russia in terms of growth?
Nonsense.
Anyway, okay, you don't accept it. Fair enough.
No, I don't. And actually,
some economists do, but I accept that you don't accept it.
Including the Bank of England, I should say.
But the point is...
What did the Windsor Agreement concede on the oven-ready deal? It's essentially... Instead of there being a Northern Ireland protocol where Northern Ireland basically remained in the European single market, there is now some checks happening on across the Irish Sea based on a red lane, green lane system, and then also some checks coming across the Irish border, but not too many, so that would break the Good Friday Agreement. That's essentially what it is. Trying to get fewer checks across the Irish Sea by having an agreement with the European Union that covers... EU goods that are going from the UK, from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and then a red lane for ones that are then going to go on to the European Union, ensuring they apply to EU standards. So not much has changed, but the border down the Irish Sea is not as strong as it was during the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Hugh Pill has made these comments. He's the chief economist of the Bank of England. People are finding it insensitive and unacceptable. But the fact is, what he's saying is right, isn't he? Because that's exactly what the government is asking a number of people
What people have asked in the audience is, what is the government going to do about it? And I think that's the important point here. We have got these global shocks that have affected the economy, and that's why the Prime Minister's priorities are to get inflation down. Because if we get inflation down, that is how we deal with the cost of living crisis, all the costs that people are talking about. And that is also why we have made all the cost of living payments available. People's energy bills are only half of what they would be because of the help the government has put into everybody's pockets and everybody's energy bills. The average family has received something like 3,000...
No, there wasn't. It was just some shuffling around. Like the Stormont break is one piece of legislation that may have some kind that the Brexiteers are wittering on about, but fundamentally, the Windsor framework didn't actually change too much. Hence why the ultra hard Brexiteers really don't like it, because they feel like that there is too much link between Northern Ireland and the European Union.
£1,000 worth of help from the government to help people through these really tough times. But ultimately, what we need to do is grow the economy, get our debt down so that we can invest more in public services and get...
Getting inflation down by because again, getting inflation down by making people poorer doesn't actually change the cost of living. It doesn't actually deal with the cost of living crisis. Because getting inflation down means changing the rate at which prices are rising, not changing the price of goods. People are still if people are finding things unaffordable now, getting inflation down does not actually fundamentally solve that, because the prices have stayed the same and people's wages have stayed the same. People's cost of living is identical, but just as time's gone on, the overall headline figure of inflation, which is the rate at which prices have been rising over the 12 months previous to the date at which you're measuring inflation, doesn't measure where the real prices are. So actually, getting inflation down isn't what's necessary here. What is actually necessary is, unfortunately, as far as Hugh Pill is concerned, unfortunately, is to raise people's wages. People have to have enough money to pay for the things that they need to buy. The only way of fixing the cost of living crisis. And if that's going to cause a wage price spiral because companies are going to start putting prices up, now fucking nationalise them. Nationalise the shit out of them if they are something with which the market you can demand nationalisation for. Obviously, food is a bit difficult. I think food prices are just going to be higher. That's one thing I think people do have to deal with. But outside of that, companies making record profits need to put up and shut up and start putting more money in their workers' pay packets. It's as simple as that.
Inflation down, and those are the things that this government is focused on doing.
Right. How are we doing? Half an hour. I'm going to take about 3 quick comments from you, and then I'm going to move on, because there's lots of questions I know you want to get through. Let me get to my you, madam in the front there. Yes.
I mean, Brexit has been a shock to the economy, and a lot of politicians are not acknowledging that. And so how can we deal with that shock if nobody's acknowledging it?
OK, woman here in the front in the glasses.
The Conservative MP made the comment that our energy bills are only half as they should be because of the contributions made by the government. But that's actually not the case. I have to tell you, my energy bills have gone up way more than that.
Yeah, the point is the support the government has given you has helped take off some of that cost.
No, it hasn't. Actually, my energy bills were probably around £400 a month. They are now standing at about £700.
I accept.
And even then, right, a line the government keep coming out with is saying that we are giving people the most support for their energy bills within Europe. Yeah, the reason why you're giving the most support is because our energy bills are the highest, because we are the most at risk of global shocks because of how reliant our economy is on gas. We're so reliant on gas that we are having to then be the people doing the most subsidy. That's not a good thing that you're saying. What you're saying is our economy is so shit, our energy model is so bad that our government has to be able to give even more, have to go into even more government debt to be able to keep our bills the same as the rest of Europe, not even the same, even still higher than the rest of Europe, because our economy is our energy market, our energy system is so poorly designed, it's so at risk of global shocks.
Except that the bills have gone up because of what Putin's done in Ukraine, but the government support has made that the fact that your energy bills are lower than they would have been had you not had any government support.
It's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah. I accept it's a difficult time,
£67
but it is government support. It is help
ocean.
for people to pay their energy bills up and down the country. Every person who's paying energy bills has had money from the government to help them.
And the woman at the back there.
Hello, I'm a teacher working in Ealing, and I found it very upsetting to hear that you're saying that we have, and Hugh Pill is saying that we have to...
And that's also true, Bilderberg. Yeah, in fact, these energy companies are literally making record profits. They don't need the government to subsidise people's energy bills. They need a fucking windfall tax that doesn't give them this investment loophole to be able to avoid paying it. They need to be taxed through the shin. I mean, to be fair, what they actually need is the oil or gas reserves in the North Sea taken off them and requisitioned by the state so that we can provide them to be able to generate this energy at cost. But I understand that that's a little bit far out for the current political climate.
Have a reduction in our income and our earnings, but also we have been, obviously teachers have been asking for more pay, but not only pay. To hear that Gillian Keegan as well is saying to us that pay rise that they are offering us or proposing to give us, which is it's not going to cover the cuts to our salary, and I'm trying to speed up here, but also the fact that it's insulting to say to us that it's going to come from our school budgets, and the school budgets that have already been run down since 2010, and apparently the funding I heard, and I looked it up, it was 5.5% of GDP that was being funding education in 2010, and actually now it's, and maybe the panel can answer this question, it's actually, why is it now 4.4% going into education? And they're telling us that it's got to come from the school budgets. And the things that I see in school and I hear happening in schools, these schools have had cuts over the last 13 years. To then say to us, again, it's got to come from the children's resources, and that means teachers and the shortages that we have already had for 13 years. And they've said it's because of austerity.
Well, it is because of austerity, but the problem is austerity was, again, as Lisa and Andy said, a political choice. A political choice that was made by the government specifically to try and run down these institutions, to be able to break public trust in them, justify privatisation, because they fundamentally are a government and a political party that are at war with the public sector. It's as simple as that.
It's just risible.
Well, and as you say, teachers are on strike today, aren't they? So, and there are more strikes to come. I'm going to, if you forgive me, I'm going to move on and take another question. Before I do, I just need to let you know that, gosh, Question Time is getting everywhere. We're now on the BBC Sounds app. Tell you. Wherever you go, you can watch and listen to this programme. So, yes, we're now on the BBC Sounds app. So yes, we're available as a podcast. Everyone's doing podcasts these days. We thought we would as well.
And also, before they move on that one, I would like to point out there is a solution for inflation of changing the model that isn't nationalisation and isn't a wage price spiral. It's the inclusive ownership fund. I know you had to get me to try and put a Corbyn policy into this yet again, but you actually get inflationary protection by the inclusive ownership fund by forcing companies to give shares in the companies to the workers who work in the workplaces. If the company makes record profits at the expense of keeping people's wages down, or at the expense of increasing prices, right, they do get record profits, and we see the kind of price gouging, which is to blame for 50% of the inflation that we've seen, according to the study from Unite the Union. They would then get paid out dividends from the shares that they hold in the company that they work for, based upon those record profits. So they can't price gouge anymore, or not as much as they otherwise could do, because then they would have to be able to pay out for their own workforce that would give them more purchasing power based upon the record profits of the company, right? Or essentially forcing companies to be able to profit share. Obviously, it would be better if they were just a worker cooperative where all of the profit was shared, so they literally cannot price gouge at all. There can be no price gouging whatsoever as far as workers are concerned. That would also be good. But, we can't have everything.
So if you'd like to listen to BBC Question, if you can't, obviously if you're listening to me now, you're watching it now. But if you're not, and you'd like to listen to it on a podcast, or who knows, you'd like to watch it again, you can listen to it on BBC Sound. Right, let's take a question from Kyle Hartnett, please.
When will the government get a grip of the housing crisis affecting young people?
So, Kyle, looking at you, you're how old, Kyle?
Sorry?
How old are you?
18.
18. And so you're describing it as a crisis. Tell me how it seems to you.
Well, the hope of me owning my own home in the next 8 years, when I'm 26, just seems impossible to me. The prices are extortionate. Even renting is just crazy in London. I don't see how it's fair that young people don't get the same chances their parents had to buy their homes. I just think it's unfair, and the government.
Yeah, but have you thought about? Have you not thought about how worse off landlords are now? Have you ever thought about the plight of landlords having to deal with a little bit of extra regulation, having to make their homes fit for human habitation? Have you heard? Do you know? I can't believe you would want to take homes away from all of these hard-working landlords that have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps to get access to a single additional property that they can then rent out to you. I can't believe you'd be so self-centered as to not consider the plight of landlords.
Should be ashamed of their record.
Okay, well, Rich, obviously I'll come to you. Lisa, how would you help Kyle?
Well, I think you're right. On current trends, a child born today has less than a 1 in 3 chance of owning their own home by the age of 50. And I think that is totally unfair, immoral and unsustainable in a modern country.
How can you be sure of that figure? I mean, we can't have any idea. Because projecting that far.
No, because we've looked back at the trends from 2010 when the Conservatives took office to now, and on current trajectory with the fall off of house building, with the fall off of home ownership, we're seeing the situation go significantly backwards from where it was in the 1980s to where it is now. So on current trends, if we don't do something to reverse these trends, we're going to have even more of a crisis facing his generation. And what I would say to you is this, that you've got to look at the housing situation.
I wonder what happened in the 1980s that might have precipitated this issue.
In the round, because the whole thing is an utter mess. We've had 15 housing ministers since 2010. We've had 6 housing ministers in the last year. I've got tins in my cupboard that have lasted longer than some of these ministers, and crucially, some of their policies as well.
So what would you do? I mean, the basic problem for you, Kyle, is that it's
End right to buy. Build council houses. Lots of council flats. Brezhnevka, I don't care what it is. Loads of new houses. High density housing. Get people housed. Get house prices down. I'm at the point at which I've stopped caring if young people want to have access to some kind of semi-detached property in a suburb or whatever it is, right? You need to get on the housing market somewhere, and it's going to need to be through lots of high-density housing with a smaller environmental impact and a smaller footprint, a smaller land value footprint, that is used to be able to get people to be able to, so they can just buy a flat. Just buy a flat for them to be able to live in, get them on the housing ladder to begin with. That's the important. Getting on the ladder is important. And also, obviously, huge blocks of new social housing as well to be able to bring rents down overall, right? Like, it's tough, right? I understand that young people want to buy a proper house, a proper semi-detached house. I get it. I get that you want that. But unfortunately, everyone's got to start somewhere, and the environmental impact of just massive, more sprawling suburbia, it's not okay. It's not going to be sustainable. The most sustainable way of doing it is lots of new high-density housing.
Affordable. So would you want to bring house prices down in some way? Is that what you'd like to see?
The crisis is in affordability, and we could sort that out tomorrow. We could introduce a permanent scheme of state-backed mortgage insurance to help people who make very high rental payments faithfully for long periods of time but don't have deposits to make the leap into home ownership. Other countries that do it, we could do it too. We could help people right now who are in the private rented sector, which has become the Wild West, by legislating.
And also, the problem is you can't lower house prices. You can't actually get house prices low. You have to keep them the same. Or you can keep them the same. Obviously, that'll piss off some people in Surrey who want to see continually appreciating housing prices. I get that. But you can't actually drop house prices because you'll push loads of mortgage holders into negative equity. It's obviously a rancid system that is being continually propped up by right to buy, by lack of building, by no social housing. That's obviously a big problem. But you can't just leave lots of new mortgage holders in the lurch. Not only because their mortgage payments have gone up significantly because of the rise in interest rates, but if their house price drops considerably and they get pushed into negative equity, they can't refinance either. So what you need to do is keep house prices identical. They have to stay stagnant. An inflationary period is the perfect time to do this. As inflation increases, the value of money goes down, so the value of the house overall goes down, but the price stays the same, right? The housing value may go down, but as long as the price stays the same, they don't go into negative equity. That's what's really important here. So that's why the biggest change that needs to happen now is council housing, to make sure that rents go down, to ensure that people who can rent and need to rent whilst they can't afford a deposit don't then get trapped into a mortgage that may or may not go down by future house price fluctuations. Sort out renting first, then we'll move on to home ownership. I'm not fussed about. I think home ownership needs to be something that we can fix later, but we need to fix renting first.
To raise standards in the private rented sector and putting an immediate ban on unfair no-notice evictions. We could mend the deliberate vandalism of our council housing stock. We've got 1 million people on social housing waiting lists in this country, and we've seen our social housing stock depleted year on year on year. And we could change this absurd...
But you won't end right to buy. Only the Greens are ending right to buy. Right to buy is where all of those houses are going. They're all going into right to buy and then going and being sold off and then owned by unscrupulous landlords so they can go live in a nicer house somewhere else once they've sold their council house, for example. It's a bad policy. End it now. Needs to be cheaper, but need to be the public sector picking it up. Just take some of the undeveloped land off the developers playing games to whittle down the affordable housing requirement and have them built by a public sector developer bought out of bankruptcy, etc., and watch the rest of them suddenly stop speculating and start building. That would help too. There are plenty of loads of different kind of multivariant solutions that we can do to fix this, which will involve some kind of public sector involvement, either on the development end or on the ownership end. Either way, that's a real issue that we do indeed have. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And also when it comes to affordable housing, we need to change the definition of affordable housing so that it is actually affordable. And our affordable housing commitments need to be more fixed in how many affordable houses need to be part of each development. We need to have it so that potentially all of these luxury flats that keep getting built, gone. Stop doing it, right? Later on, maybe we can start looking at luxury flats being built for potential speculators or whatever, but it needs stopped now, being entirely replaced by only affordable housing.
The definition of affordability, because the government will tell you that they've put money into affordable housing, but what they won't tell you is that 90% of that money has gone into affordable, not social housing. And that means houses that are currently at 80% of market rent. Well, in this borough of Ealing, a rental accommodation, an average rental property that is deemed affordable is over £450 a week. I don't know in whose world that is affordable.
£450 a fucking week? £1,800 a month? What the fuck? How does anyone afford that? I guess it is London, to be fair, when London is expensive for housing, but Jesus, that is crazy. That's absolutely fucking crazy. When I was renting in Manchester, I was paying £400 a month.
Affordable, but that has got to change.
And what sort of time frame? What sort of time frame are you talking about? Should you win the next election? I mean, you know, say for example, Kyle's renting, and you would help him use the sort of credit, if you like, from that rent to be able to get to buy a house, but there isn't enough housing stock. Yep. You want to create more social housing stock. Are we talking about after 10 years that this might be sorted out?
No, so
because you say we do it right now, but you couldn't do it right now.
We've set a target to restore home ownership to 70% of the population within the first term of a Labour government. We would legislate in the first 100 days to raise standards in the private rented sector to deal with the crisis that a lot of people are dealing with now. And we're already working with developers, investors, councils and planning authorities to see what we can do to hit the ground running on day one of a Labour government.
So how many houses would you
need?
So how many houses would you need to build in those 4 years in order to do that?
Well, the figure the government's just abandoned was 300,000.
How many would you have to
it never met that figure, and it's not clear where they got it from. So we're working with the industry at the moment to work out how many houses we would need to build year on year in order to meet housing need. But the crucial thing is this: it's not just enough to boost supply, and we're committed to building houses in the middle of a housing crisis. You've got to build the sort of homes that people can afford to buy, and this definition of affordable is utterly absurd, and it needs to change.
Leila.
So, to Kyle's question, I mean, it's just insane in London, isn't it? It's like £1,000 for a one-bedroom flat, one bedroom in a flat that you share with other people. That's before bills, right? So where is the money meant to come from for anything else, let alone saving for that deposit? And I've got my younger sister's in that position. I know loads of people in that position. And it kind of feels like that social contract has been broken, because the life that your parents had, you just...
Oh, you don't say! Oh, you're saying that loads of political policy has basically entirely been at the beholden of a single generation of people for 45 fucking years? I only just noticed that political policy was entirely beholden to people born in the 1950s. Whoa! Mind blown. Social contract destroyed by neoliberalism? You don't say.
It's just nowhere close. To the solution, Shelter, the charity, has estimated that we need something like 150,000 new homes a year at least. And the focus for the Liberal Democrats would be on homes for social rent. The reason why that's often not
I mean, the government set a target which it hasn't met of 300,000, but you're saying that's way too many, you need half that.
No, that Shelter has said that's the absolute minimum that you need. And that's actually, I'm not sure if that's been met either. So we need to focus on, but the key thing here is, it's not just about building homes hoping that the market's going to settle, right? Because what happens, and we've seen it a lot in Oxfordshire, they build huge housing developments, no infrastructure that goes in place, no schools, no roads, none of that. And then they are 4-bedroom executive homes starting at 600,000. We had a local development where it started, a 1-bedroom flat started at 300,000. That's just simply not going to allow someone like Carl to get on the housing ladder. So what you need is affordable rents that are genuinely affordable and linked to local income. So absolutely right, 80% of market value in the southeast is just laughable. Instead, have it linked to what the average income is in an area, and that would allow you to set that rent at something that is genuinely affordable. The thing that I just want to bring in...
Briefly, because I need to get around the audience.
In Oxford, we're seeing a lot of this, and what's happening is that young people just move out. They move away. They want to stay and start a family and then have their parents...
I mean, that's literally happening in Ireland right now. But they're not moving out of Dublin. They're not moving out of Cork. They're not moving out of wherever it might be. They're moving out of the fucking country, right? Young people are deserting Ireland because of the housing crisis, where having lifted an eviction ban, like thousands of families just getting turfed out on the streets with literally nowhere else to go, and ended up essentially just staying in police stations. It's crazy. The housing crisis in Ireland is even worse than it is here, and it's gotten so bad that young people are coming of age and then they are fleeing the country because they cannot afford to live.
There so that they can be part of it and, you know, help look after the kids. They are putting off having children in the first place, then they move far away. It's breaking our society that we're not getting this right. And so I thank him for his question, because I think it's a really existential problem for this country.
Well, let's hear what people in the audience...
Yeah, social contract dead because of neoliberalism. Like, I like Layla Moran on a bunch of different issues, but it's incredibly fucking rich from the party that propped up David fucking Cameron to come to me and say, there's this existential crisis with the breakdown of the social contract and the issue with the housing crisis. I'm like, you facilitated this. That's your fucking fault. That's your party's fault. You're coming to me telling us that you have this massive plan. Where was that plan when you were literally in government in 2010, whilst you propped up the worst government this country has ever had? Like, I just cannot take it seriously from any Liberal Democrat.
Audience think of it. Yes, the man there with his hand up. Yes, towards the back.
I was going to give a direct answer to Carl's question, and the answer is...
I mean, yeah, if they hadn't done the coalition, like, which Lib Dem policy would have seen the light of day? Which Lib Dem policies saw the light of day in the coalition? What, a 5p bag charge at the expense of benefit sanctions? That's what we got, right? That's what we got from the Liberal Democrats propping up the Conservative government's ruinous austerity programme. It's because they're not a progressive party. They are a neoliberal party. They've always been, since the death of Charles Kennedy, they've essentially always been a neoliberal party. And I would not trust them as far as I could fucking throw them, quite frankly.
If you wanted to change, vote. The problem is that so much of what we're seeing is to do with the change in demographics in this country, that it's completely distorted the electoral situation. The Conservatives have no interest in looking after the interests of young people. That is the bottom line. And is apathy amongst the young people. They've got to get out and vote for people who are going to support their interests. Then you might see things change.
Okay.
True. I mean, you've heard me say this on this channel loads of times. There is no point in the Conservatives, nor the Labour Party, quite frankly, caring about the interests of young people, because they are not the swing voters in the electoral system. They all live in cities. They all vote Labour. All of those constituencies are already red. They're not a swing voter, so they get left by the wayside. They don't have to care about them at all. They can just continue passing Villiers amendments and things like that, protecting the property equity of a bunch of people who live in rural suburban communities, for example, where there's actually a swing vote, especially in the north, and young people get completely ignored. And also, it's within their interest to do that, because young people then continue moving to the cities, continue moving where all the jobs are. The property prices continue to get worse across the country, and young people continue to get siloed in safe seats. It's completely fucked from like the ground up. Great question.
There are luxury apartments springing up all over Ealing, and I'm sure that's true in many parts of the country. Who are they for? They're not for families. They're investment opportunities, and they're often left empty. The ones in Hanwell, just down the road. Hanwell, look it up on a map, everyone. Right? They're marketed in Dubai and Hong Kong. They're not for people. They're not for families. They're for people to park their money.
Yeah. OK. There's a couple of women further back. Yes. Two women sitting next to each other with their hands up. Let's hear from both of you. Yes.
When I turned 18, I opened a LISA, but the limit for that is £450,000, yet the Greenford properties, which are recently being built, are over £450,000 or just under for, say, a one-bed. By the time I'm in a position to buy a property, I'm pretty sure I'll be priced out of Greenford, even though I've been investing money into a LISA.
Into a lifetime ISA you're talking about,
ISA, yeah.
OK, and that woman next to you, I think you had your hand up, did you? Or did you not? And you're looking terrified that I'm looking at you. All right, let's hear from... Yes, the man there in the black jacket and the white shirt.
Yes, thank you. I actually work in the housing sector in terms of housing planning delivery, and what I'd say are a couple of things that are shocking. First of all, the Prime Minister hasn't put housing in his top 5 priorities. That's shocking, given it's a national crisis. And then the move by the 70 backbenchers to remove the housing targets, the local housing targets, has decimated the progression of local plans that are the sort of cement to determine where housing should be delivered. That is shocking. And unless there is effectively a cross-party political agreement on actually determining maybe regional housing targets, which then everyone can agree upon to start seeing housing delivery happen, we are going to be in this impasse. And that's for all tenures of homes that this country needs. So we need more consensus across the political spectrum to get housing delivered.
Richard, you just want to answer those points quickly.
I feel like there's been a lot of points, and I will try and do them justice. So first of all, I do agree that this is a huge priority, and we absolutely want to get...
Why isn't the Prime Minister's priority? They're talking about NOS canisters and stopping the boats. And here you are saying, oh, actually, it's a big priority. Then why is the government fucking ignoring it? Why are they continually cucking themselves out to people like Theresa Villiers trying to ensure that housing targets and additional or relaxation of planning regulations to be able to facilitate new housing buildings? Why Liz Truss was elected Prime Minister off the back of saying that housing targets were fucking Stalinist, and you're telling me, as a Conservative minister, that it's one of your top priorities? Go fuck yourself.
Houses built for young people like
But
Kyle.
the gentleman there saying it's not on
You want
the
me to
Prime Minister's
answer
5
that
priority.
one
Well, I'm just saying, you're saying...
specifically?
No, in fairness, I'm just saying you say it's a huge priority. The gentleman there pointing out it's not one of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities.
Drop the housing target.
Well, I think we can all argue about the priorities that the Prime Minister has, but at the end of the day, he's got to have some priorities. And if we're getting the economy growing, if we're getting wages up, if we're dealing with inflation, those are the things that are going to put more money in people's pockets and help them to buy a house. What I would observe, actually, is we're here in London, the responsibility...
Getting inflation down doesn't put more money in people's pockets. That's just a fucking... That's just not true. That's just a lie. What are you talking about? Like, inflation is about consumer price inflation, not asset price inflation. The way people are going to put more money in people's pockets is by giving them fucking pay rises, which you've already said we don't even need to give them earlier on in this fucking segment. This is she's been on Question Time multiple times, and this minister is just the fucking dirt worst, the absolute dregs of the Conservative Party.
For housing is devolved to the Labour Mayor of London. He has a lot of levers that he can pull in terms of where he's building houses, how affordable they are, and what types of houses he are building. So I think...
Yeah, go on, blame someone else.
We need to sort of look at what local areas are doing. But I want to just say to Kyle, this is an absolutely vital priority. I am the housing minister. It is what I am focused on. Just a couple of things I'd like to put into the mix. We are going to do a renters reform bill. That's coming very soon, because I think Lisa's absolutely right about the Section 21 no-fault evictions. We will be abolishing those. That's a manifesto commitment that we stood on, and we will be doing it. But I think we are also looking at many years of governments, let's be honest about this, that haven't built enough houses. Labour had a woeful record when they were in government.
Far better record than you.
They built. Can I just finish?
I mean, actually, it's not true. Labour didn't have a better record than the Conservatives. More council houses got built under Boris Johnson's short tenure that got built under a decade of Tony Blair. Like, New Labour are just as much to blame. Now, that I know that Lisa Nandy is not quite a Blairite. She's close, but she's not quite. And she clearly does repudiate the failures of house building under the Labour Party, under New Labour as well. So I will give her the benefit of the doubt on this one. But Rachel McLean is right. New Labour massively failed on housing too, specifically because they spent their entirety of the electoral chops defending and pandering to the property-owning middle classes rather than young people.
Yeah. No. You built less houses than since the 1920s. You had an absolutely shocking record.
That is factually incorrect.
Can I just make my point? And then you can come back.
Okay, Lisa, let her make a point, and then you can make
I have got facts. I don't want to sort of get into that. You had a very...
It's almost the problem is the fact that under New Labour and under the Conservatives, both parties were fundamentally working along the same economic ideology, and that economic ideology completely failed the country, doesn't work, and is really bad.
I know we like facts on this programme, Rachel, very much we like facts. By all means, let's hear your facts, of course.
Okay, the Labour governments, they built the lowest number of houses since the 1920s. Labour in Wales last year built just 5,000 houses, Labour-run Wales.
Let her finish and then you can come back.
We have now got house building up to its highest record. We had something like 240,000 houses built last year. It has taken...
That's 60,000 behind the target.
this long to recover from Labour's financial crash. I think Lisa's incredibly naive when she says it could be fixed tomorrow.
I'm sorry,
she demonstrates
you can't talk about financial crashes when you had trust.
Lack of understanding of how the housing market works.
Right.
This is long-term infrastructure planning. We do need to get houses built. And
she's so bad. She's like, why the Conservative Party thought fit to put this woman on TV? I have no idea. Can't even win an argument where they have some truth in. Literally, like the one argument where they actually aren't telling a bunch of complete lies or mistruths or misdirections, and she can't even win that.
And that's the work that we are doing, and that's why we have all the work that is going on. Can we the Affordable Homes Programme? Can we delivering houses for young people?
Can I just briefly bring this debate back to reality? I started out life working for a charity called Centrepoint, working with young homeless teenagers on the streets of London at a time when the last Labour government was at the beginning of eradicating rough sleeping in this country. During that time, we built 185,000 homes on average a year.
Yeah, literally telling poor people that they're not poor. Like lying about how bringing down inflation would make people's lives more affordable, and it just literally doesn't, because it just fixes prices where they are rather than sees it increasing further. And then third of all, not even being able to properly articulate the failures of neoliberal policy under New Labour, because they follow an identical playbook with regards to housing policy. Like, it's so pathetic. So pathetic.
Over the intervening decade, after the Conservatives and the Coalition came to power, that plummeted by 20,000 homes a year on average. And you want to talk about Sadiq Khan? Sadiq Khan has built 36,000 homes a year, 10,000 more than his predecessor, Boris Johnson. He smashed records on building council properties and affordable homes. More council housing built on his tenure since the 1970s. And the truth is this: the reason that the housing situation for most people in this country is absolutely dire is because of this Conservative government. After the devastation of the Second World War...
And also New Labour, and also Right to Buy, and also Margaret Thatcher, basically. Actually, Margaret Thatcher precipitated all of this because she instigated the kind of Right to Buy that we see right now. And she created this legion of homeowners amongst a certain subgroup of a generation, particularly. Don't know, I'm not going to mention them this time. But they create a legion of homeowners under Thatcher in the 80s who shaped political policy because of how large the cohort was, which forced New Labour to pander to them by not building any new houses, gave them de facto a complete political control over policy when it came to house building and austerity from 2010 to 2016. And they're the ones throwing their toys out of the pram now that Liz Truss has crashed the housing market.
War, the Attlee government built more council homes than any other government in history to date. The last Labour government continued that legacy by building more homes and bringing...
Wrong. Lies. Not true, Lisa. Just don't lie. You don't need to lie. You can just skewer the government on their own terms. You don't have to lie about New Labour, because they fundamentally did fail on housing. You can't pull the wool over my eyes, Lisa. New Labour were garbage on housing. You can admit that. You can admit that you'd failed on housing before, and then say that, well, look, we now have seen the failure of how we handled that, and we have a plan to be able to fix it moving forward. You can say that, but don't lie. Just don't lie, Lisa. It's not good.
500,000 social homes up to a decent home standard.
I'm afraid...
And you should be ashamed of yourself
I'm afraid
for trying to airbrush that out.
Quickly.
The fact is, she's talking about the Attlee government. Her government, the last Labour government, built the lowest number of houses since the 1920s. That was what Labour did while they were in. We have built 2.2 million homes since we were in, but we need to do more.
Okay.
We're under no illusion.
So, yeah, literally under target for the entirety of the period since 2010. Well done.
OK, taking the politics out of this, everyone on the panel and in the audience seems to agree that we should be building more housing. I think what's been interesting about people's attitudes towards housing is we may have left the era of NIMBYism, because quite a lot of people you might associate with being NIMBY, not in my backyard, might be older Conservative voters who are now becoming more YIMBY because, as Kyle...
They're not becoming more YIMBY. They are not fans of these policies that you're trying to put forward here. They still care about protecting their housing equity. The reason why they're supporting Labour is because Liz Truss increased their mortgages. She fucked with the Rule 101 of electoral politics in the UK, which is you do not fuck with people's mortgages. I mean, or they're just dying, right? They might also be dying, but...
pointed out, they want their children and their grandchildren to be able to live near them in perhaps their...
No, they actually don't care about their children. I've met these people. They do not care about their children's housing, their housing prospects. They think that it's our fault for eating too much avocado toast and paying for Netflix.
Better off areas and leafy shires. There's a number of practical problems here as well, which we were discussing earlier. For instance, this situation where developers get planning permission to build developments, and then they're able to sit on these planning permissions for years and years and years, so nothing gets done. What they're doing by that is they're hoping that the price of this land goes up so they can then sell it to others. There is also this issue of people buying properties off plan in other countries, as the gentleman pointed out up there, and never actually living in them. Having said that, I will give the government some credit. One good thing that they have done on housing is to give people who have got leasehold and freehold properties a bit more control. We've had a situation that's bubbled up over the course of recent decades where particularly people in leasehold properties keep on getting done over by the management agents asking them for ever higher ground rents and all the rest of it.
Leasehold.
I think we should. Yeah, we should. But isn't Michael Gove suggesting doing that? To be fair, Lisa, I think Michael Gove has advocated that.
For 13 years.
Right, OK. Well, did you advocate it?
Where is it? No,
did Labour advocate it under Tony Blair? Because I don't remember that policy.
I've worked in housing for a decade before I came into Parliament. I can tell you that I've been advocating it all that time.
But the last Labour administration, to be fair, the last Labour administration didn't do anything about these.
The next Labour government will.
That's how this problem started.